Good morning and welcome to the second session of the Ethics Issues Surrounding Addiction in the VR Process webinar. My name is Crystal George and I will be your host today. Notice the webinar control panel along the right side of your screen. There is a question box there. If you are able to hear me, could you please go ahead and type yes? And I already see some people are saying yes, they can hear me. Great. If you're calling in today by phone only, please be sure to email untwise@unt.edu to receive credit for your participation. At the end of the session, I'll provide more information about receiving credit for this webinar. Now, I would like to welcome back our presenter, Judith. Judith, we're happy to have you back and are looking forward to part 2 today.
Good morning, and thank you, Crystal and Nick. Hello, everybody. I hope that those of you that are with us today were also joining us last week. If not, well, if you're new to the webinar, welcome. And so what I will do now, if nobody minds, is basically just kind of touch base. I know we left off talking about signs and symptoms of addiction, but before we get back to where we had left off, I do want to go over the objectives very quickly. So those are to recognize signs and symptoms of addiction when working with consumers, identify the disability in addiction, identify the practitioner's responsibility and response to difficult situations, and to utilize community support services as natural, long-term employment support. So I'd like for you to think about the ethical guidelines that we must consider when supporting a person with a history of substance abuse or dependence. And remember, abuse is not as severe as dependence. Dependence is synonymous with addiction. So think about that. What ethical guidelines must we consider when supporting a person with a history of abuse, substance abuse, or dependence? Anybody have any feedback? It's not too early in the morning to ask questions. Comments? Hint, hint. Green and white slides that I included in the PowerPoint.
Somebody asked if you would repeat your question.
Oh, okay. What ethical guidelines must we consider when supporting a person with a history of substance abuse? What were the ethical guidelines that we discussed last week? And if you're looking at your handout, that's fine. You can. That's not cheating. I won't consider that cheating. But basically,
someone has said confidentiality was one that they believed we were looking at last week.
Ooh, yes. Good, good. And then also, remember, I always ask, what is the primary responsibility of rehab counselors or rehab professionals and service providers? What is that primary responsibility?
We have people saying respecting the client, respecting diversity. Dignity and promoting the welfare of the individual.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to touch base on these just as a review. Again, just to kind of go over what we discussed last week, but also to share this with those of you that may not have been with us last week. So, primary responsibility of the rehab counselor is to respect the dignity and to promote the welfare of clients. And okay, remember, I mentioned that. That is very important because when we deal with consumers that are recovering from addiction, the dignity and promoting welfare, their welfare, is not something that they have had probably for a long, long time because, as I mentioned, recovery, addiction, even abuse, substance abuse, addiction, and even recovery still have a lot of stigma attached to it. And so we still face a lot of attitudinal barriers, even though we seem to be more educated about the types of drugs and about dependence and more open to recovery and counseling. There's still a lot of stigma attached, and again, that these consumers really have not been given that dignity, and you know, they haven't even promoted their own welfare, much less having somebody else promote it, especially the people that they associate or have associated with. So the rehabilitation and counseling plans, when we're talking about welfare of those served by the rehabilitation counselors, the rehab counselors and clients work jointly. Okay, now again, this is part of our code of ethics, working jointly with the consumers and devising and revising integrated individual and mutually agreed upon rehab counseling plans. And those that offer a reasonable promise of success. So we're ethically bound to do that. And that's where self-help, you know, support groups and different types of treatment and self-help come into play. But sometimes, even though consumers with addiction want to remain in recovery, that devising and revising integrated individual mutually agreed upon rehab and counseling plans, they often differ with that. Okay, because recovery is a lot of work. It really is. So we have that obligation, ethically speaking, we have that obligation to lead them, to guide them, and to help them make the decision to make use of that support and that treatment. But recovery is, that work is very hard. There's a lot of introspection. Sometimes an assignment given by a counselor, for example, write your life story, is so hard that you know, the consumer may not want to go back to that type of a counseling plan. That if you include recovery, like self-help or counseling sessions as part of that plan, because they're having to face all of the ugliness that they survived, okay, and dig deep into what caused them to use for the very, very first time. Okay, and then of course the employment needs. Now remember, as it says here, rehabilitation counselors work with clients to consider employment consistent with the overall abilities, functional capabilities and limitations, general temperament, social skills, and so forth. But again, this is, we're ethically obligated to do this, but with this consumer, this type of consumer or this population, they may not have those skills. They may not have had them before they started using, or may have lost them. And then we'll talk about this a little bit more, but work in itself can be a trigger. Okay, the stress or even the paycheck can be a trigger. So again, we're ethically bound to help them in this way and be non-judgmental and provide you know, unconditional positive regard. However, we also need them to do their part, and that doesn't always work, but we still have to be ethical. And of course, autonomy. Now, as I mentioned last time, the autonomy, sometimes that's what has gotten this population into trouble. Okay, too much time on their hands, making their own decisions, making the wrong decisions. So although here it says rehabilitation counselors respect the rights of clients to make decisions on their own behalf, that's a skill that they're still trying to learn to do, okay? Because that autonomy, those choices have led them into trouble or into addiction, into drug use and legal trouble as well. And then, of course, respecting culture. And, the drug culture is a culture. It has its own language, its own little etiquette. And, again, we need to respect that, not just, okay, what is our ethnicity? What culture is associated with that? What's the normal, culture that society accepts? But we have to, again, be non-judgmental and respect the drug culture that this consumer came from. And of course, non-discrimination. Make sure that we do not condone or engage in discrimination with this population. They're very, very prone to it. And we need to keep that in mind whenever we're trying to place them in a job. Okay, and avoiding value imposition. When we work with this population, again, our values and morals can come into play. More so if we see that this consumer is lacking in values and morals and really wants to change and is coming to you for that guidance, for that advice. We need to help them. We're ethically obligated to help them, but without imposing our own values and morals. So that's a very, very fine line. And most of all, advocacy and accessibility, because these consumers need to be given a chance. And we may be their only chance. You may be their only chance. And so when you are advocating and considering accessibility, as we're ethically bound to do, that may mean you attending, for example, an AA meeting to see if it's accessible. For example, is the site, the venue, big enough to accommodate someone in a wheelchair? Do they offer information in Braille, for example? And if you're placing this consumer at a job site, how is that employer going to look at this consumer having not only survived addiction, but possibly having to leave work early sometimes to attend a meeting? Different things like that. So you will have to advocate and be aware of accessibility for these consumers. And then, of course, keep in mind not only our code of ethics, but the principles of ethical behavior, veracity, autonomy. We discussed these last week. Questions, comments on any of these right now?
We don't have any questions, but we have a comment that says they appreciate you pointing out the drug culture that someone came from. I think oftentimes this is overlooked.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And yes, you are very right. It is overlooked. Again, we still, there's still too many people out there that judge. And, at times, rightfully so, because we have to be aware of their culture. That includes, being very street smart. That's what they do to survive. That's how they survive out there, okay? But, again, we need to try to understand it, more so if we're working with these consumers, and really learn it. Again, not just learn about the different drugs that are out there, but learn about the trends, learn about the language, and, as I said, the etiquette, and so forth, because that shows that you really, you are genuinely trying to help. And again, that may include you having to attend a support group meeting where maybe you never have done that. And there's nothing wrong with going that extra step and asking permission of, the person that hosts the support group meeting, to see if you can sit in, just so you can get an idea of what's available so you can share with your consumers. Okay, and so we talked about forms and methods of taking drugs, and I appreciated the comment that was made last week where you're talking about one of the pictures I included that showed some signs that you can see on some of the consumers if they choose to use drugs, to shoot up drugs, for example, heroin. And you'll see the track marks and sometimes sores. So I'll try not to be too gross, but I did include some pictures, but that way it'll give you also a little bit more insight. But the forms and methods of taking drugs through oral ingestion, topical application, like a nicotine patch, vaginal, rectal, the injections, IV in the vein, or intramuscular, and subcutaneously. And then, of course, inhalation when you're smoking or snorting, for example, snorting cocaine, which affects the mucous membrane. Okay, and this is the picture I included. So I have similar ones down the line. And then one thing I wanted to make sure that I touched base on, because I think we were about at time last week when I covered this slide. Remember that volatile substances are not drugs. They're chemicals, basically poisons to your body, to the consumer's body. Most of the time, you see these used by the younger generation, for example, the teens or middle school, and then young adults. So here's some signs. For example, you can look at the color, or rather their sleeves. If they're wearing long sleeves, and at the cuff they have, for example, markings made by the permanent markers. That what they do is mark their sleeve, the cuff, and then they'll be smelling that, inhaling that, white out. One thing I wanted to point out was the problem with this is that all of these substances are easily obtainable, and it doesn't matter if someone's underage. These are in your own home. For example, the gasoline, if you have a can of gasoline in the garage, or again, whiteout markers, the permanent markers, or even those that you use on a dry erase board. If you've ever used it, oh gosh, they smell. Some of them smell so much that they can just smell up the whole room. So things like that, they're just easily obtainable, and they're everywhere. And what happens is that we become so used to seeing them, and we don't think anything of it. So if a teen is using this and abusing these substances, we may not even notice, because it isn't anything out of the ordinary. For example, the aerosols, spray paints, deodorant, hairsprays, things like that. So again, and glues, so very much things that we have around the house. Questions, comments on any of this information?
Not at this time.
Okay. Okay, so signs and symptoms of addiction. What is the nature of addiction, and do users have the choice to first use? And are they forced to use, or do they actually have a choice to use? And the reason I ask is because You may be dealing, if you deal with teens or young adults, they may have been forced to use by their parents. That is not uncommon. So again, if we are not careful and we're judging instead of trying to be um, ethical about working with this consumer, we may say, well, you had that choice. And a lot of people do say that. They say, you had the choice to use for the very first time or to not use, or to continue using or to stop. And that may not always be the case. I remember years ago, I was talking with one of the judges here in Edinburgh, and we were talking about perhaps collaborating on some research, a research study, and a grant project. And I remember her telling me, if I had the answer to how to stop parents from forcing their children to use, to actually teaching them to use for the very first time, she says, boy, that'd be worth a lot of money and would solve so many problems. Because she was telling me, she says, I see that the time, all the time. And parents, again, they don't, even think twice about having their children use with them, or to go and score drugs with them, or to deal. So we may always think, well, you had that choice to pick up for the very first time, pick up that drug or use that drug, but that may not always be the case. So why the attraction to use? Well, again, it goes back to what is our motive? What is the motive? There's no one factor that explains the development of substance-related disorders. The contributing factors are biological, psychological, social, cultural, and environmental. Now, as I was talking about the parents, that's their culture. That in that family, that's their culture. And look at the environment that the child is in. And then they grow, they go into middle school or high school, or they're a young adult, and they remain in that same environment. That's what's familiar. That's their culture. So again, that's their drug culture. But all in all, people use to relieve pain, stress, tension, depression. They're searching for pleasure. They give in to peer pressure. They use to enhance religious or mystical experiences or social experiences, or enhance work performance, and of course to relieve pain or symptoms of an illness. And that's where prescription drug use comes into play. Questions, comments at all?
We do have a question. Somebody asked, what is the typical age that this begins happening with parents teaching their children to use and to deal?
Well, we used to say it was middle school, and it usually is, because, about that age, 12, 13, the child can be good at learning how to deal, right? And perhaps, that's how the family is going to make their money. So they have that concept of, that so-called business concept, right? But it's not uncommon for a parent to start engaging their child at a much younger age, or to having them use for the first time at a much younger age. Several years ago, and this is over 10 years ago, had a family member that was a teenager that was put into a rehab program, 30 days. And he liked to use spray paint, okay? And going over there and visiting, and of course, talking to the counselors and so forth, you get to see and to know some of the other people that are in there at the same facility. There was, at that time, I believe an 8 or 9-year-old little boy, that had already experienced using heroin, shooting up heroin. The parents helped. And that was many years ago. Things have progressed, they've worsened. So again, the common age was middle school, but it's not uncommon to see a child that's younger already involved in this culture. Now, I ask you, isn't it kind of hard not to be ethical? I mean, to 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 really try to be non-judgmental. What if you're working with that parent now? What if that parent, and you know the history, did this to their child, and that's your consumer? How hard is it for you, or how hard would it be for you to truly be ethical, non-judgmental, and provide unconditional positive regard? That's just something for you to think about. I mean, if you want to comment, by all means, go ahead.
Yes, one person says that's a very challenging situation.
Yes, very much so. And for people that decide to go into counseling, personal counseling, a lot of times they do not want to work with this population because it's so challenging. And not to be judgmental, but the little joke holds true when they say, how do you know when an addict is lying? When he or she is moving their mouth. Okay, so you have to be aware of that. But again, that's how they've survived. And knowing this background, this type of culture, a lot of counselors will say, no, I'll stick to mental health instead of becoming, for example, a licensed chemical dependency counselor. But we need more LCDCs, licensed chemical dependency counselors, out there. But it's very challenging. But you know what? It's very rewarding. It really, really is, because when you see that change, or even when you are around that population and you see them in recovery, and you listen to their stories, and you're sitting there and you're going, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you survived that. Or you're thinking, wow, and I thought I had it bad. See, that's the positive that comes out, is where you learn to appreciate the everyday blessings, and it's even more rewarding when you see them starting to appreciate the everyday blessings, the even having a job, keeping a job, and just not using for that one day. It's very, very rewarding, and you learn a lot. You really do. Even just attending support group meetings, you learn a lot. Okay, so factors that affect nature of drug use, we said are pharmacological factors, cultural factors, social factors, and contextual factors. So the key factors to consider in understanding drug abuse is the person's personality. That's a big, big part. The person's drug of choice, and the person's context of drug use. Again, where are they? Where do they like to use? Who are they with? What is their environment like? These factors are connected and cannot be separated. Now, let me just back up here a little bit. The person's drug of choice. Some people may say, yeah, well, I used Coke, and I'm not addicted. I didn't use it anymore. I used it once and didn't use it anymore. Well, that's not so much that they have that that strength to not use again, but it could be, and most of the time is, that drug was not their drug of choice. Now let's say marijuana is, and then they use it for the first time the following weekend. That may be their drug of choice, and that's what they start using. Okay, so if somebody says, well, I didn't use that again, I only used it once, that's probably because they had a bad experience and it just wasn't their drug of choice. So that's something you want to consider as well. Okay, and then when does use lead to abuse? It depends on the amount of drug taken. that does not necessarily determine abuse. Remember, we said, you could misuse a drug or start abusing a drug. But again, what's very, very important is the motive for taking the drug. That's extremely important for you to remember. What caused it? Why did they turn to that drug use for the very first time? What was the motive? And initial drug abuse symptoms include excessive use, constant preoccupation about the availability and supply of the drug, refusal to admit excessive use, and reliance on the drug. Again, at the root of all addiction is pain. And if you really, and again, you immerse yourself in that culture, so to speak, by learning more about the culture, sitting in on support group meetings, and just listening, you really realize that, this is very true. At the root of all addiction is pain, and I'll show you why. I love this picture because it really helps put into perspective that statement, that at the root of addiction is pain. Okay, so just like, when you plant a tree, a little tree, you worry about the soil. You want it to nurture that tree, the roots, so it will grow well. And the soil of addiction often is physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and spiritual abuse. This is what they have experienced. So that foundation, that soil, is already unhealthy. Okay. Then the little roots start growing, right? You have rejection, shame, fear, loneliness, anger, grief, and hereditary factors go into play as well. Anger from the sexual abuse, maybe rejection, that maybe the person was abandoned or rejected when they try to say, I was sexually abused, but they were rejected, or they were abandoned and not taken care of and put into that situation. And so there it goes. That little tree of addictions starts growing and growing, and the person becomes addicted. They search out alcohol, any other drugs, gambling, sex, work, people, which we call codependency when a person is addicted to another person. And this is very common in the drug culture, very common. That's why you have enablers, which we'll discuss in a minute. But again, and we don't have to just focus on drugs. Food can be a drug. Work can be a drug, or religion. So, questions on this at all?
We do not have any questions, but we do have people commenting saying they really do like this visual representation of this as well.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that comment. Thank you. I'm a visual learner, so that's why I like to include pictures, but I have to be careful not to include really gross ones. And so some major risk factors, because here's a person dealing with all of this, right? Here we go. So the risk factors for addiction are the use of alcohol and other drugs, using those alone, okay, or using alcohol and other drugs in order to help stress or anxiety, or the availability of drugs. Again, if that's very common in the environment in which the person is living or existing, working around, drugs are right there. So if they're in recovery, how are they going to stay strong enough to say, no, I am not going to allow myself to relapse or even slip, okay? Slip, we usually say, is when somebody goes and uses for perhaps 2 weeks, really no more than 2 weeks, okay? And they go back and they get back into recovery. Relapse is when they continue using more than that. As I said last week, some people will actually get lost for weeks, maybe even a month or two, because they're just so busy using. They're preoccupied with the use of drugs and getting those drugs. Abusive or neglectful parents, dysfunctional family, misperception of peer norms regarding the extent of alcohol and or drug use, alienation factors, isolation, and so forth. So remember that risk factors differ for each person, social, cultural, and age groups, and individual and family idiosyncrasies or quirks. So that also comes into play. So they differ. Okay, now the family itself can be a risk factor. Their powerlessness over addiction. This is where the codependency comes into play. Okay, so here's the family trying to prevent that addict from hitting rock bottom, refusing to believe that addiction is a disease, and their rescue from addiction consequences. They're rescuing their family member, the addict. And you'll see that here they are, all the family members in the picture are trying to do everything they possibly can to keep the alcoholic in the picture from basically going off the cliff, okay, and perhaps, dying. And that's what happens. They are a risk factor because they get so consumed with trying to do everything they can to have that power over the addiction. They don't realize that they are powerless, okay? And they become the enablers, and they become codependent. And so trying to keep someone in recovery with a family that is like that, that's a risk factor. Because what happens is they get so used to trying to save or help, enabling and being codependent to the person with the addiction, that when that person recovers, that's something new to them. So they don't understand it and they don't like it because they're not needed anymore. Okay, so that's something, again, that this person is considering, along with, please help me, please place me in a job that, where I can start working and get my life back together. Okay, so again, when you're working with this population, consider all of the factors when you're trying to be, to work with them in an ethical manner. It's very, very challenging. It really is, but I know you can do it. Okay, risk factor, we talked about enabling. I love this cartoon because I said, yep, this is it. Son, I completed all 12 steps for you. They're in your bedroom with your clean laundry. But the mom has courage to change, that little courage to change picture on her wall, but she's not changing. He did, but she's not. So this is pretty much what happens. And again, they like to give the person with the addiction money and help them. And when that person starts working, they start earning money. But when they're using or when they relapse, as Dr. Field says, here's a very simple solution. You don't give a drug addict cash. I don't care if they say my hair is on fire, I need an extinguisher. You don't give a drug addict cash. So I always say, if someone asks me for money, well, I need some money for gas, I need $20. You see these people panhandling out at some of these convenience stores. I always say, well, you know what? Why don't you pull your car up to the gas pump? I'll buy you some gas. I'll pay for the gas. Oh, I need some money for groceries. Okay, well, H-E-B's across the street. Let's go. What do you need? I will buy your groceries, but I don't give cash. Don't give it. Questions so far?
No, just a couple of comments saying that they understand where you're coming from.
Okay, drug dependence, we talked about this. Physical dependence and psychological dependence, we touched base on those. Addiction, remember, refers to mind and body dependence. Tolerance, withdrawal, this is what a lot of people with addictions will experience, that compulsiveness, that increasing time spent in substance-related activities, going out and trying to obtain the drug and using it and recovering from the effects. It's just a cycle. Tolerance, remember that with tolerance, that means that the person needs more of that drug that they were taking. The same dose no longer suffices. For example, my back is injured and I've been given muscle relaxants. 5 milligrams used to help me cope with the back pain when I would have it. You know, if I kept taking it, that pretty much wouldn't help anymore. I'd have to increase it to maybe 10 or 15. And, you know, so that's tolerance, when you're taking the same drug, but you need more of it because that first dose just, you know, what you took at the first dose just doesn't work anymore. Okay, so stages of drug dependence: that relief, increased use, and preoccupation, and the addiction cycle. They're going to act out. They feel guilty for using, and the shame and depression sets in. So then they stay in recovery for a while, maybe a day, maybe a month, maybe a year, and then all of a sudden, there they go. They relapse again, okay? And they give in to that stress that's caused them to act out. So that's pretty much the cycle. And you can tell, you learn to be able to distinguish, you know, if they're acting out, if they're depressed, if they're, you know, in danger of relapsing. Once you really start working with this population and you really start trying to learn the culture, you do recognize. But I always say, when you ask to sit in support group meetings, that's when you really learn a lot. Okay, and then major models of addiction: moral model and disease model. Basically, moral model says poor morals and lifestyle are the reason that a person uses. Some models even say, well, you know, your personality and that predisposition are the cause for the addiction. So the signs and symptoms when you're working with consumers: again, they don't care about themselves. They're not going to be dressing up. They may not look very clean. They'll look a little disheveled. Using drugs, they start using drugs to deal with a problem. They have legal problems. They're irritable. Maybe they start arguments, or there's violent outbursts, there's inappropriate spending, and so forth. And a big factor, key factor, is that depression and anxiety. And then again, look at their environment. The dilated, constricted pupils, slurred speech, blackouts, insomnia, that low self-esteem, that's a big red flag. The low self-esteem, any resentment, not being able to forgive themselves for doing what they did, for harming themselves and others. Questions so far?
We do have a question. Are there strategies for working around constraints of agencies when you're working with someone with an addiction?
Well, ethically speaking, you really need to abide by what your agency is, what they say, what they expect, and, you know, what they expect you to do and not do. My way around it would be to look at it as networking. And hopefully we'll get to those slides, but networking, that's a big help to you and to your consumers, because you need to become aware of whatever supports are out there, correct? That includes the self-help, the AA, the NA, and that's why I say I recommend sit in at one, into one or two of the sessions. If you don't feel comfortable in that group, find another NA group. If you don't like where the venue is, the site, the facility, for example, maybe it's in a bad location, then find another one. But be aware of that, because this is how I would approach it. I would say, well, I know our agency doesn't allow this, this, and that. However, in the month of September, that's National Recovery Month. And I know some of the agencies out there, some of the support groups. Why don't we try to collaborate with them? Why don't we try to help them and see how they can help us for the betterment of our consumers? That's how I would approach it. Anybody else have an idea? And also, did I answer your question?
Yes, you answered the person's question.
Any other ideas? Okay. Networking is a big thing, and who's going to really say no to trying to collaborate with other agencies? That happens, but really, if you approach it in the manner that it's all good, we're trying to help each other. This is a big problem. We're trying to help each other, trying to help our consumers, and we're trying to be ethical because we're obligated to share this information. We're obligated. Why not? Why not ask for permission? Why not approach it in that manner? These are just these are the pictures I included. So you'll see up at the top on the left-hand corner, the top left-hand corner, those are needle marks, but they're fresh needle marks. So it's almost as if you go and you get a flu shot. You can see the little mark right away. It's kind of fresh. Down over here, right below that, you'll see where sores have already developed. A lot of times people will think, oh, addicts will shoot up only on their arms. No. Neck, legs, feet, not just on the arms. So if you're looking for track marks, fresh or old track marks on a person, for example, on a consumer, don't be surprised if you also see some track marks, for example, around their necks. And addiction, again, it's not just drug addiction, but when you're looking at, for example, someone dealing with anorexia, it's still an addiction. It's still an addiction. And in their minds, they're looking at themselves as being fat, even though they're this skinny as the girl shown in the picture. When someone uses meth, for example, you see how they age so quickly. Now, these can quickly become consumers or people with disabilities because, for example, the picture of Heather there, just in 3 years, she changed dramatically. She was actually she was cooking meth, and there was an explosion. That usually happens. It's not uncommon, and so she was burned. And so now she is someone not just with an addiction, but with a disability because it affected her whole body. And then, of course, another sign is if you see the person's teeth, we call that meth mouth. And looking back, again, let's think about ethics. How do we not judge this, or how do we advocate for this consumer when an employer sees that they have meth mouth and perhaps is aware of, okay, I know what that is and I know what this person does. And you're trying to advocate for your consumer with that employer. Questions, comments?
We do have one. It says, referring to the pictures, I've also seen addicts who do not display weight loss. Is that because some drugs cause increased appetite?
For example, somebody that uses marijuana, that's a big thing, is the munchies. That's why people with cancer will say they want to use it for medicinal purposes, or somebody that has HIV, because, for example, if a person with cancer is going through chemo and they can't eat, then yeah, so they smoke marijuana, they will get the munchies and probably end up at Sonic. No, just kidding. But yes, they do gain weight, and sometimes it could be not just so much the drug not allowing them to lose weight, but it could be the stage of use. For example, maybe they're just abusing and they're not into full-blown addiction yet. So therefore, you look at them, you're like, no, couldn't be using drugs, but they're really not in full-blown addiction and experiencing all of the other major side effects and the illnesses that come with that. Okay, the disability and addiction, again, the stages of addiction cycle. Basically, you know, there's just drugs on the brain. And ADA protects the following types of disability, those that are current, recorded, or regarded. So physical or mental impairment that is a substantial limitation of a major life activity. Those are, for example, the ADL's manual tasks learning. And we need to, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we need to consider the residual effects of drug use. I showed you the picture of Heather, but there's others that all of a sudden are diagnosed with HIV, or by the time they seek medical attention, if they do, instead of maybe ending up in an emergency room because of an overdose, they may be in full-blown, they may have full-blown AIDS. Hep C from using needles, sharing dirty needles. And it's not accesses, it's abscesses, as we saw in the picture. Okay, so that record of physical or mental impairment that substantially limited a major life activity, that is drug addiction. It substantially limited a major life activity. Even recovery can limit a major life activity because they have to learn a whole new way of living. They can't just say, oh yes, I'm going to keep this job, I'm going to get that paycheck, and I'm going to be fine. Those can be triggers, the stress of the job, getting that money in their pocket, and all of a sudden they've had a very stressful day, they don't have to go to work the next day, and guess what? It's Friday, time to party. So even that paycheck can be a big trigger. So addiction, yes, it does cause a record of physical or mental impairment that substantially limited a major life activity. And regarded as having such an impairment. Again, we need to consider others' attitudes, that attitudinal barrier. So when the consumer doesn't have impairments but who is treated by a public entity as having an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity like an addiction, then they can identify as having that disability and be protected by ADA, under ADA. Questions so far? Questions, comments?
We don't have any question. Well, I guess we do have a question. Do you think that people with addiction, if they knew that they could maybe qualify under ADA, they might be more open to discussing that, their addiction?
I would say yes, provided that, and this is what I'm leading to in the next slides, provided that they know it's a safe environment to discuss that, because there's so much self-pity and they're just so hard on themselves when they really try to get into recovery and stay in recovery. There's so much shame and guilt, so they're embarrassed to talk about it. A lot of them really are embarrassed. And when what they try to learn at meetings is, or even through counseling, and this is where you come in, being aware of, okay, who are the LCDCs in our area? Who are those substance abuse counselors in our area? Where are those support group meetings? How open are we to working with these consumers and really listening to their stories? Because it's so incredible to listen to their stories, but at the same time we have to be careful that we don't let them get carried away and those become war stories. In other words, oh yeah, I'm bragging. Because when they're doing that, again, that war story can become a trigger for somebody else that's in recovery. So it's a fine line, and again, it's kind of, you know, being strict, not being judgmental, just providing good guidelines and being open to that. And I actually think that, yeah, they would. They would. I have heard some people that I know that are in recovery, they've asked, well, you know, what is that ADA? And would I qualify? You know, but they always come back to how understanding will they be of addiction and my recovery? That's a good question. Any other comments, questions?
We do have another one. It says, are there rehab facilities that provide support for drug addicts with low income or without health insurance?
Yes. Now, we have here in the Rio Grande Valley, we used to have what they called Texas Commission on Alcohol and Drug Abuse. That's now a different part of Department of Health Services, I think it is now. And we used to have an office that was overseen by Takata. And they would provide counseling, free counseling, or depending on if the person was already working and just trying to stay in recovery, needed counseling sessions, maybe would pay, you know, $5 a session. But if somebody was in full-blown addiction and was trying to recover, they could go there, and that office was responsible for looking for the proper facility. Maybe it's an inpatient. Maybe somebody would be better at an outpatient facility. How much money do they have? Well, they don't have any. Okay, well, I know of this facility in Corpus or this facility in Edinburgh that has a bed, and they receive funds, the facility receives funds, so the person with the addiction doesn't have to pay anything if they qualify. So yes. Actually, there's also a place out in Fredericksburg, and if a person qualifies to receive free services at that rehab center, and it's a 28, 30-day inpatient, they can go in and stay there for 28, 30 days as long as there's a bed, and they don't have to pay anything. But again, those are very hard to come by because a lot of these people that are in or need to be in recovery or need to go into an inpatient facility don't have insurance. Maybe they did, but once the addiction took over, there goes everything. So that's a very, very good question. But yes, there are facilities out there. They're just hard to find. Other comments, questions?
Those are the only, oh, nope, we just had one come in. It says, currently there aren't many programs for addicts who are incarcerated or become incarcerated. Do you think some form of legislation will pass to help them in the future?
That, I believe it will. Again, if we have more of us working towards that. And, you know, we need to, in a sense, look at the families, the background of some of these senators, congressmen, and so forth. For example, we had one of our state representatives that was very active, did a lot for our area, but when his son died of an overdose when he was about age 17, and he had already been become a father. He had a baby girl. When the son passed away, then the focus changed. So more work was done in that area, more awareness by this representative, and he also was instrumental in getting a facility for teens, an inpatient facility for teens built here in our area. So it can be done, but again, we have to be open, non-judgmental, and do what we can, what we're ethically bound to do. You know, we need to be the ones that advocate for that to change things. But yes, good questions. Wow, I love all these questions and comments. Awesome. Any other questions, comments?
Not at this time.
Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead because I know we are limited on time, but I do, I had a case study, but I think we've pretty much covered a lot of this. The recovery, again, please be aware of AA, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps. Be aware of these and be open to, you know, learning about them, sharing about them, letting consumers know, you know what, I may not understand everything, but I'm trying, and it's okay. It's safe for you to discuss this. And we talked about the life skills training, really trying to learn how to start life all over again, from something as simple as taking care of themselves to how not to go out and use when they receive a paycheck once they have a job. And people do relapse. It is almost impossible for someone not to relapse, and that's okay as long as they get back up and they keep going and they stay in recovery, and you help them if that's your consumer. You know, encourage them. It's very, very rare when someone does not relapse, when they just say, that's it, I'm done with this, and doesn't relapse. Luckily, one of my friends who's a counselor was one of those people who just said, no, I've had enough. So recovery has to come first. Everything is that way. Everything that the person loves in life does not have to come last like it always has. So recovery is of utmost importance. That's it. It has to be a way of life, not just for the person in recovery, but for the family. Because remember, they become the enablers and become codependent. So they need to get into recovery as well. And that's part of the battle. And I want to ask you, I want you to think, what visual awareness is in your agency? Do you have posters or resources as AA meetings, a list of AA meetings? Are you aware that September is Recovery Month? You know, do you have maybe, for example, posters like this one, Addiction, There is a Way Out? You don't necessarily maybe provide addiction counseling, but you let your consumers know it's okay. I understand. And again, it's a safe place, and I'm here to help you. I'm here to learn and to do whatever I ethically I can do and what I'm bound to do so that you can remain in recovery and you can be a success. You can have a successful career and, you know, get back to living the way we should live. So that's just something I wanted you to think about. And, you know, again, that's the first steps. Ask permission. Or, you know, come September, ask, hey, can we celebrate this? Is there something that we can do? Maybe just give out the little ribbons or wear them. You know, that brings awareness. Questions, comments?
We don't have any questions. I know at UNT, where UNTWISE is located, we have the collegiate recovery at our university. So in fact, in our building downstairs, they're very focused on recovery and mental health. So there are a lot of signs and stuff in our building alone on campus.
Oh, that's awesome because it lets people know, you know, that's okay. I'm not going to be judged. This is where I won't be judged. and this is where I can receive help, so, or, and support. So that's awesome. And really, that's all. That's what it's all about. It's that's what it's all about. That's what we're here to do as rehab professionals. That's why it's called rehab. Any other questions, comments at all?
No, just more thank yous for another great presentation.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you, Crystal and Nick, for helping, and for those of you that joined us and that commented and asked questions. I so appreciate your participation. So you have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll meet again in another webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judith. We've recorded this webinar and it will be posted on the UNTY's website if you'd like to go back and review any of the sections. You will receive an email with an evaluation link for this webinar. Please complete that. Your feedback is definitely vital for us improving our webinar listings. As always, a certificate of completion will be uploaded to your user portal within the next 3 to 5 business days. And if you need a CRC form, please reach out to untys@unt.edu. Again, we appreciate your attention and attendance today, and we hope you have a great day and a great weekend.